In the year 2000, a single company controlled 90% of the brains inside every computer on the planet, and it was worth $509 billion.
We're looking at the slowest and most expensive downfall in the history of technology. Intel didn't collapse overnight. It bled out decision by decision, starting with the time Steve Jobs asked them to build the chip for a new phone, and they said they weren't interested.
Today, that company is worth less than $120 billion, while Nvidia, a company that back then was barely a graphics card maker for video games, is worth over $4 trillion. But to understand how Intel went from the undisputed queen of chips to a stumbling giant, we need to go back to 1968, to a garage in California where two scientists, Robert Noyce and Gordon Moore, have just left Fairchild Semiconductor, one of the world's first electronics component factories, where Noyce had co-invented the integrated circuit, basically the piece that lets you pack thousands of electronic components onto a tiny sliver of silicon. They leave because Fairchild isn't reinvesting enough money in research, and they want to move faster. They found Intel in Mountain View, California, with a dozen engineers and one clear idea: to make memory chips. They're joined by Andy Grove, a Hungarian engineer who had fled communist Hungary at 20 and who would become the operational soul of the company. The guy who turned Noyce and Moore's brilliant ideas into an unstoppable execution machine. For the first 15 years, things go incredibly well. Intel dominates the DRAM memory market, the components every computer needs to function, and grows at a brutal pace. But in the early 80s, Japanese manufacturers start flooding the market with cheaper memory chips, selling them even below what it costs to produce them. A strategy designed to drown out American competition by capturing the entire market, even if it means losing money in the short term. And it works. Intel starts bleeding out on its own flagship product.
And this is where Andy Grove makes the most painful and most brilliant decision in Intel's history. Because the easy thing would have been to keep fighting party, but Grove saw something nobody else wanted to see.
Grove sits down with Gordon Moore in 1985 and hits him with a brutal question. If the board fired them both tomorrow and hired someone new to save the company, what would that person do? Moore doesn't hesitate for a second. They'd pull Intel out of the memory business because it's a lost cause. And Grove says, then let's do it ourselves before someone forces us to. Intel shuts down 8 factories, lays off 8,000 people, and abandons the product that made it great. In 1986, it loses $180 million on $1.3 billion in revenue, the only annual loss in its entire history. But the pain has a purpose. Intel stops making memory chips and goes all in on microprocessors, the brain that makes a computer think, run programs, and function. It's like a restaurant chain owner shutting down every burger joint to bet everything on a new dish nobody's tried yet. Except that new dish was the future of digital civilization.
Only the paranoid survive. That's what Andy Grove said, and it wasn't a nice phrase for a posters, it was a survival manual. When your flagship product is dying, the paranoid acts before the body goes cold.
The bet pays off in ways nobody could have imagined. In the 90s, Intel becomes a monster. Its alliance with Microsoft, known as Wintel, creates a self-reinforcing cycle. Every new version of Windows needs more processing power, and every new Intel chip enables more ambitious software, a spiral where both win and everyone else gets left behind. Between them, they control 90% of the personal computers on the planet. But Intel does more than just make good chips. It launches Intel Inside, one of the boldest marketing campaigns in the history of technology. It turns an invisible component, a chip that nobody sees, nobody touches, and nobody understands, into a brand that consumers ask for by name. Computer manufacturers get a 6% discount on processors in exchange for slapping the Intel logo on every laptop and every ad. And it works so well that people start buying computers not for the manufacturer's brand, but for what's inside them. By the year 2000, Intel reaches a market capitalization, what the company is worth on the stock market, of $509 billion. It's the absolute and undisputed king of semiconductors, the industry that makes the chips that power everything electronic.
See what Intel did with Intel Inside? It turned a product nobody understands into a brand everybody wants. That's not marketing, Kai. That's creating demand where there was only indifference.
But this is where the story takes a turn. Because when you're the king and you've been winning with the same formula for decades, it's very easy to believe that formula will work forever. And in 2005, someone knocks on Intel's door with an opportunity that could have rewritten the company's history. Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple, asks Intel to build the chip for a completely new phone that Apple is designing in secret, a phone that Jobs believes will revolutionize the entire industry. Paul Otellini, Intel's CEO at the time, runs the numbers and says no. The reasons seem logical on paper. The margins on a mobile phone chip are much lower than on a PC processor. Intel is used to keeping 60 cents of every dollar it brings in after paying for manufacturing. And the deal Apple is offering doesn't come close to half of that. On top of that, Otellini doesn't buy Jobs' sales projections. Nobody at Intel imagines a phone could sell in quantities massive enough to justify the investment. Years later, Otellini himself will publicly admit the forecasted cost was wrong, and the volume was 100 times what anyone thought. That phone was the iPhone. And that no from Intel didn't just close the door on a client. It closed the door on an entire market, the biggest in the history of consumer electronics. Because the chip architecture, the foundational design on which a processor is built, that Apple chose instead, called ARM, designed to consume little energy rather than maximize raw power, became the absolute standard for smartphones. And Intel was left watching from the sidelines as the world moved from the desktop to the pocket. And the iPhone was just the beginning. Because while Intel kept squeezing its old formula of selling expensive processors for desktop computers, the tech world was moving in several directions at once, and Intel was going to be late to all of them. In 2014, AMD, the eternal rival that Intel had treated like an annoying fly for decades, puts Lisa Su in charge, an electrical engineer with a PhD from MIT. Her arrival is about to flip the entire industry. Because in 2017, AMD launches the Ryzen processors, built on a completely new architecture called Zen, a ground-up redesign of how a processor organizes and executes instructions that delivers 52% more performance than the previous generation, a leap the industry had never seen before. And the worst part for Intel? AMD makes them in TSMC's factories, a Taiwanese company that exclusively manufactures chips that others design, which are already better than Intel's. In just 3 years, AMD goes from having less than 10% of the processor market to over 30%, eating market share straight off Intel's plate, and at a lower price. And while AMD was stealing clients, Intel couldn't even meet its own manufacturing deadlines. Its next-generation chips, the 10-nanometer ones, a measure of how small you can make the circuits inside a chip, the smaller they are, the more powerful and efficient, arrived in 2019, 4 years behind schedule. While TSMC kept delivering year after year, leapfrogging Intel with every generation, the company that invented the chip could no longer make the best ones.
Look at the paradox. Intel did everything. It designed and manufactured its own chips. TSMC only manufactures for others. And it turns out that specializing in one thing and doing it better than anyone was the winning strategy.
And then comes the blow that hurts the most. After rejecting the iPhone, Apple did end up hiring Intel, but for the brains of its Mac computers, a business Intel considered worthy of its league. For 14 years, every Mac in the world ran on Intel processors. Until, in 2020, Apple announces it's going to stop using Intel chips in all its Mac computers. Apple designs its own processor, the M1, a chip that for the first time combines brain and memory in a single piece. And the first laptops running it are faster, quieter, and get twice the battery life of the Intel models. By 2023, there isn't a single Mac left with an Intel chip inside. The company that Intel rejected as a client for the iPhone has now fired it as a computer supplier. In 2021, Intel brings back Pat Gelsinger, a legendary engineer who had started at Intel at 18 years old as CEO, with an almost impossible mission: to reinvent the company from the ground up. Gelsinger announces an ambitious plan. Intel will stop manufacturing only its own chips and will open its factories to make chips for others. Exactly what TSMC has been doing so successfully. The United States government backs him with $8.5 billion from the CHIPS Act, a law designed to bring chip manufacturing back to American soil. But while Gelsinger tries to rebuild Intel from the inside, the tech world explodes in a direction nobody saw coming. Nvidia had been making GPUs for years, graphics processors, the chips that make video games look good. And it turns out those same chips are perfect for training artificial intelligence models, because they can do thousands of calculations at once instead of one after another. When the AI boom explodes in 2023, Nvidia goes from being worth $300 billion to surpassing $4 trillion in just 2 years. Intel, which could have competed in that market, has nothing to offer. And in December 2024, Intel's board loses patience with Gelsinger. They force him to resign because progress is too slow and the losses won't stop. 9 months later, in a twist nobody could have predicted, Nvidia invests $5 billion in Intel, the king of AI, buying a piece of the fallen giant to use its factories.
And this is where Intel's story becomes something you can apply to your business today. First lesson. Intel said no to the iPhone because the margins were low. But that small market became the biggest in history.
If a client asks you for something that doesn't make you much money today, but could grow, think twice before saying no. Whoever controls today's small market can control tomorrow's big one.
Second lesson. Comfort is the most expensive grave in the business world.
Intel was so comfortable making 60% on every PC processor that it didn't see the world was moving to mobile first and artificial intelligence second. If you're not a little uncomfortable with your own plans, you're probably already late. Because by the time you feel the ground shifting beneath your feet, you'll be years behind, and your competitors will have already taken the territory.
Third lesson: when engineers lose their voice, the company loses its way.
When Intel went from being led by engineers like Andy Grove to being run by financial managers who optimized costs, it stopped innovating. If the people who understand your product don't have a say in strategy, you're making blind decisions about the future of your company.
Fourth and final lesson: controlling everything works until the market explodes in 1,000 directions.
Intel designed and manufactured its chips. It was their pride. But when the market fragmented, mobile, AI, servers, Internet of Things, the flexible model of TSMC, which only manufactures for others and does it better than anyone, won the game. Sometimes it's more powerful to be the best at one part of the chain than to try to control the whole chain yourself.
So the next time you look at your business and think, "This works? Why change?" Remember Intel. Because the company that invented the brain of every computer in the world ended up needing its biggest rival to buy a piece of it just to survive. The business graveyard is full of companies that were once the best in the world and believed that was enough.